On the 20th of February 1643, Henrietta Maria, the Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland, dived behind a dune off the windswept Yorkshire coast. There she hid with her small group of ladies and a handful of soldiers, as musket fire and cannonballs whistled over her head and thumped into the sand next to her. There she saw soldiers killed no more than 20 yards from her, as men from her adopted country tried to kill her. How had things got to this tragic stage? Hello and welcome to the English Civil Wars from History Workshops. In this series, we are looking at everything and anything related to the English Civil Wars. The causes, the characters, battles, weapons and tactics, the role of women, the barber surgeon, politics, and so much more. If you missed our last episode, just here, we looked at the little-known wars that the young King Charles I waged. First, against the mighty Spanish Empire, and then the French. Both would prove ruinous to king and country, but more importantly, would sow the seeds of discontent, which would eventually lead to civil war. So Henrietta Maria, she has gone down in history as a Lady Macbeth in Charles I's court, a Catholic fanatic who drove and nagged her husband into foolish adventures, a French queen who conspired to bring foreign armies into the country to fight the king's enemies, a Catholic queen who did not understand Protestant Britain and did all in her power to convert the country to the old faith, despite the dangers this would cause. She has been painted as the most reviled consort to have worn the crown of Britain's three kingdoms. She has been condemned as that Popish brat of France, a notorious whore and traitor. But is this too one-sided? Hopefully we will see she was more than just a Catholic conniver. She was faithful, resilient and stout-hearted, with the courage of a company of the hardiest pikemen.
Henrietta Maria was born in November 1609 in the Louvre. She was named after her parents, the formidable pairing of Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV, and Marie de Medici. She was born into the House of Bourbon, and was the youngest sister of the future Louis XIII of France. From the very beginning, she was surrounded by the true majesty of monarchy and the complete devotion to the Catholic Church. As a fille de France, she was educated as a royal princess. She was instructed in dancing, riding, singing, being in plays. But all this took a back seat to the serious religious training she was to receive. Her wealthy and opulent upbringing required her to have her own staff, which numbered around 200 people. In 1622, when she was only 15, her marriage was already being discussed. This marriage would have been of incredible importance, with the need for military alliances, as the bloody 30 Years' War was already 4 years old. The man she was to marry had actually met her in 1623, when Charles, as Prince of Wales, had trekked across France to Spain to claim the hand of the Spanish Infanta. He and the Duke of Buckingham had stopped off in Paris on the way there. It was here that they had briefly met. Charles's secret trip to Spain had turned into a disaster. Charles and Buckingham had returned to England empty-handed. So back in England, humiliated and angered by the Spanish, Charles and his father James looked elsewhere for a bride. They didn't look far, just across the channel as it happens. Charles sent his close friend and confidant, Henry Rich, the first Earl of Holland, to organise the marriage. Henry Rich served Charles well. He loved France, and he was himself a godson to Henry IV of France. He was to fight for the royalist cause in the English Civil Wars, and was captured and executed during the Second Civil War. Charles himself was keen for the marriage to the French princess, and very eager to see his soon-to-be bride. He thought she was beautiful, although opinions at the time differed. Her niece, Sophia of Hanover, commented that the beautiful portraits of Van Dyck had given me such a fine idea of all the ladies of England, that I was surprised to see that the Queen, who I had seen as so beautiful and lean, was a woman well past her prime. Her arms were long and lean, her shoulders uneven, and some of her teeth were coming out of her mouth like tusks. She did, however, have pretty eyes, nose, and a good complexion. But no matter how she looked, This 15-year-old girl was going to have a strange coronation, and an even stranger start to her marriage. The coronation in particular mirrors only too clearly recent goings-on at Britain's latest coronation. The proxy wedding between the two occurred at Notre Dame Cathedral. Henrietta Maria had her brother with her, Louis XIII, as well as her mother, Marie de Medici. The proxy for Charles was one Duc de Chevreuse. Even though the Duke was a Catholic himself, Charles was adamant that he should not enter the cathedral for the Catholic Mass. Charles was determined that right from the start, he would not entertain the Catholic faith, even though his wife was one. The Duke agreed, but his duty was not done yet. He himself had to climb into the Queen's bed that night and touch legs as a way to symbolise that the marriage had been consummated. After the wedding, Henrietta Maria left for England, where she was to meet her older husband, in a foreign country with an alien religion. The weight of responsibility on her young shoulders was crushing. The two were married in person in June, yet although married, she was never crowned queen. As the king's coronation was a Protestant one, she was forced to watch the coronation service from a distance. An unfortunate incident that has been mirrored in our modern times, with members of our royal family being sidelined. But even before she had begun her royal duties, there was a question as to what she should be called. Henriette or Henrietta was apparently too fanciful for English taste. There were prayers offered up to her as Queen Henry, and the king himself stated she should be known as Queen Mary. Unfortunately for Charles, using the term Queen Mary, his grandmother, would remind his English and Scottish subjects of the last Catholic Queen Mary, a queen who had ended with her neck on the block. And so, Henrietta Maria's life began in a land where she did not speak the language, was devoted to a religion that was reviled, and that her new adopted country was about to go to war with her mother country of France. Even the most talented, warm, and inspirational character would have struggled to make things work. Her being French was obviously a huge stumbling block for the British Protestant public, especially as France was at this time beginning to persecute their own Protestant inhabitants. These Protestant minorities, or Huguenots, would be a big factor in Britain declaring war on France, which would lead to an angry contest between the king and Parliament, and ultimately the death of the king's favourite, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. But the main issue for the public was not only the Queen's Roman Catholic faith, but her openness about it. Historians have said she flaunted it. Maybe she did, or maybe her simple devotedness to religion was seen as a sinister radicalism. Her chapel at Somerset House was open for the public to explore the mysteries of the old religion, and slowly, steadily with the Queen's aid, it began to gain a new glamour. The Puritan press and Puritan clique in Parliament were angered, not only by this Catholic boldness, but also the king's reluctance to restrict it. The Puritans thundered, priests, friars and Jesuits walking at noon while superstition and idolatry flourished at court. In 1628, Henrietta Maria became pregnant for the first time. But sadly, in 1629, the child died shortly after birth, following a difficult labour. The king's love for his wife during these years can be seen in his letters to her, as he addressed her as Dear Heart. Yet from 1629, when Charles dissolved Parliament for 11 years, Henrietta Maria was effectively safe from parliamentary attack, and she was to enjoy her life with her husband. Those 11 years where the royal couple were to alienate their subjects were the most enjoyable for Henrietta Maria and Charles. And in 1630, she gave birth to the first of their surviving children, the future Charles II. In these halcyon days, she and her husband would indulge in their passion of art and creating a royal collection of international renown. Henrietta Maria would surround herself with expensive possessions, which obviously did not endear her to her subjects. She would collect plate, clothing, furniture, jewellery, paintings, sculptures and books. And like the king, she patronised some of the greatest artists and designers who had ever lived. men such as Van Dyck, Indigo Jones, and André Mollet. And as well as her Catholic household, it is recorded that she kept several dwarves, dogs, caged birds, and even monkeys. And on top of this, she flew in the face of accepted court etiquette and performed as an actress in many plays and masks. It was also in these years, after a cold and distant start, that the King and Queen actually grew into a loving, married couple. In the early days, Charles's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, would take up all of the King's time, and would take his advice and not that of his wife, the Queen. But following the assassination of Buckingham and the execution of Strafford, Henrietta Maria became Charles's chief, unofficial advisor. This drew them closer into a loving relationship, but alienated her further in the eyes of the public, as every unpopular decision made by the King was seen to have been forced on him by his foreign, Catholic and manipulative wife. She may have been criticised for things she did not do, but other things were sure to antagonise a public just looking for reasons to complain and protest. One example took place in 1626. On a journey, she ordered her escort to stop at Tyburn, where she prayed for the Catholics who were executed there. As well, she tried, unsuccessfully, to convert Prince Rupert to the Catholic faith. Misgivings about her and her evil influence over the King increased when she requested that her sons were brought up as Catholics, as well as assisting Catholic marriages, which at this time were against the law. Becoming involved in religious politics was one thing, but blood was soon to be spilled in the name of the Queen. The year after Charles dissolved Parliament for 11 years, a Scottish doctor, Alexander Leighton, criticised the Queen in a pamphlet. Before he was imprisoned for life, he was flogged, branded, and mutilated. Years later, a well-known Puritan, William Prynne, wrote that women actresses were notorious whores. This was a clear insult against the Queen, as she was well known for being in plays. His punishment? To have his ears cut off. Yet in 1640, when the King had to recall Parliament to assist him in his war against the Scots, the attacks on the Queen and her religion began afresh. The refusal of Parliament to dissolve and their insistence that they meet at least once a year would mean there could be leadership and real organisation against this Catholic menace. Parliament reported to the Venetian ambassador, "Let it be freely understood that they, the parliamentarians, will not allow Parliament to be dissolved any more, but only prorogued, so that it shall meet every year." In 1641, the year before the Civil War commenced, Puritan sermons bellowed against tyranny, popery and oppression, in an effort to rouse the public to destroy the old religion entirely. Their voices carried far, as rumours abounded that the Queen had solicited the Vatican itself for funds so the King could fight against the Protestant Scots. It got so bad that angry crowds even attacked the Catholic congregation as they came out of the Queen's chapel. The stunned worshippers were attacked with weapons and stones. If this was not painful enough for the Queen, she was informed that she must remove all her household who were Catholics. Now this may seem a fairly trivial thing to do, but we must remember these Catholic members had known her for years, would speak French, would understand her needs and her frailties. There would have been some very close companions, and now she was forced to say goodbye to them. But Henrietta Maria showed her teeth and bit back. She hissed, "If my Catholic household are to go, then I will remove the Protestant ones as well." Yet day after day, the religion she loved was under attack. A certain Jesuit priest called Goodman had been condemned to death for treason. But to Parliament's horror, the priest's fate had had a reprieve from the King at the request of the Queen. Parliament warned, or perhaps threatened, the King that if the sentence was not carried out, they assured him what action Parliament would take, and they also threatened the Queen with greater ills. Now this shows several lights on Charles. In this case he differed, he changed his mind, agreed to his wife's wishes, and then to protect his wife, agreed to Parliament's demands. His love for Henrietta Maria and his desire to keep her safe is clear, but what also is plain is his lack of control and fear of public unrest. But as time progressed, she drifted from the sights of her enemies for a short while, as Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, became public enemy number 1. Recalled from Ireland to put bite and backbone into the king, he was arrested by Parliament for treason. For such a hated figure, it seems an own goal by the king and queen to attend the trial to support the earl. But they did. Even worse, the queen attended late-night covert meetings with members of the opposition. The plan was to use loyal courtiers and army officers who had returned from the Scottish Wars to spring the Earl from the Tower of London. It shows a side of Henrietta Maria which is not often seen. This dangerous, exciting mission is in complete contrast to the delicate portraits we see of her. Again, her love for her husband is clear. Despite universal loathing for Wentworth, as he was the king's man, she would do her utmost to assist him. But this plan, the so-called army plot, was doomed to failure. Word got out and eventually came to the attention of the king's nemesis, John Pym. Pym used the plot to bring in a bill of attainder against Wentworth. This ancient piece of legislation essentially assigned guilt to the accused and allowed the death sentence to be passed. Having passed through the Commons and then sent to the Lords were soon assailed by an angry mob, no doubt recruited by Pym. They howled for justice and refused to be pacified by mere words, and threatened violent actions against His Majesty's own person and all the royal house. The threats to the king and queen continued. As the rabble continued to grow in noise and menace, the Archbishop of York reported to the king that it was no longer a question of whether he should save the Earl of Strafford, but whether he, the Queen and his children would perish with him. With the king signing the Earl's death warrant, he appeared a broken man and never forgave himself for his action. Henrietta Maria was shaken too, and shed real tears, and told her companion, Madame de Moville, how she and the king had both foreseen the Earl's death would lead to one of them losing their life and the other to lose their mind. And yet things would rapidly get worse. The Queen was implicated in the rumours of a suspected French invasion, as well as having a relationship with her horsemaster Henry Jermyn. The Venetian ambassador again was on hand, and stated that Parliament was trawling through ancient documents to see how to proceed, and whether the Queen would need to explain her actions. For the King, however, his greatest headache at the time was the trouble with the Scots. He planned to head north in the summer to come to some kind of understanding. The Queen herself, afraid in London, wished to head to Holland with the Princess Royal for their health. Parliament, suspicious of her intentions in travelling abroad, questioned her doctor, who returned saying, despite an unquiet mind, she did not need to travel for reasons of health, and the Princess Royal should not travel abroad until she was older. Her depression began to get darker as she wrote to her sister Christine. She wrote, "From the highest point of happiness, I am fallen into despair. Imagine what I feel, to see the king's power taken from him, the Catholics persecuted, the priests hanged, the people faithful to us sent away and pursued for their lives because they served the king. As for myself, I am kept like a prisoner, so that they will not even allow me to follow the king who is going to Scotland, and with no one in the world to whom I can confide my troubles. It is all too easy to feel her pain and isolation at this moment." The king's surprisingly warm welcome back in London was a short-lived respite. The angry mobs had not really gone away. Apprentices were up in arms, and it was here that the terms Roundheads and Cavaliers were starting to be used. Charles, for his own defence, decided to create an armed guard for his household, made out of loyal trained band officers. However, Parliament spun this move and claimed that the king's action and his resentment were due to the advice of the Queen. Soon in Parliament, they were accusing her of conspiring against the public liberty, and also conspiring in the rebellion in Ireland. Soon after this, the king was enraged to hear that Parliament was planning on starting impeachment proceedings against the Queen herself. Charles, maybe surprisingly, sprung into action, and descended himself on the Commons to arrest the infamous 5 members who had conspired against him. As we all know, word had got to Parliament in time, and the birds had flown. Charles had fallen into a carefully baited trap. It was a critical error. Whilst Charles was being embarrassed by the Commons, Henrietta Maria was waiting impatiently at the palace. She spoke to the Countess of Carlisle. "Rejoice, for at this hour the King, I hope, is master of the state, and such are doubtless under arrest." But her hopes were dashed as a disappointed king returned. Within a week, the royal household had all but fled Whitehall, and moved into a totally unprepared Hampton Court. Rooms were not made up, food was scarce, fires were not lit, and things were so bad the royal family had to sleep in one bed for warmth. But the King and Queen had to move once more, this time to Windsor for added security. Yet even this was not enough. It was all too clear that the country was becoming too hot for the Queen. She was to leave the country once more for Holland, and this time Parliament agreed. Perhaps they reasoned the King was easier to deal with without the stubbornness of the Queen behind him. But Parliament was uneasy as to what the Queen was to take with her. When she boarded the warship Lion, she had with her a large amount of her personal jewellery, as well as the Grand Sauncey, which once belonged to Charles's father, and was said to be the most valuable white diamond in Western Europe. She was also carrying a vast diamond called the Mirror of Portugal, which had been Elizabeth I's, several gold collars, rubies, and pearls belonging to Henry VIII. These priceless items that belonged to the royal family, and thus the nation, were to be used to assist the king in any future struggles. These shiny baubles would be sold for weapons, ammunition, and men.
So what do you think so far? Has history got Henrietta Maria right in that she was a conniving, sinister threat to the British way of life? Or was she a brave, loyal and resilient girl who had to grow up fast in an alien and dangerous world? Let us know in the comments below. In our next episode, we will see the Queen take on the role of an international arms dealer and the self-appointed She Majesty Generalissima. If you missed our last episode on the unknown wars of Charles I, follow the link in the description box below. As always, thanks for watching, please give us a subscribe, and of course, God save the King.